2018. We're so excited to welcome our policy experts on the Violence Against Women Act. We have Terry Poore with the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence and Lynn Rosenthal with the Biden Foundation. Before we get started, I just want to give a broad overview of who we are at All In Together and what we do. All In Together is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization, and we deliver action-oriented, nonpartisan civic education to voting age American women and to help them realize their full potential as leaders shaping our nation. Our programming is really broad, but we've been talking a lot about policy related to violence against women in the last few months. In November 2017, we launched the Gretchen Carlson Leadership Initiative to bring our civic education trainings to women who have experienced interpersonal violence. So we're really excited to welcome people to our All In Together community who have a real vested interest in the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. So without further ado, I want to introduce Lynn Rosenthal, who is the Director for Violence Against Women Initiative at the Biden Foundation, and she's going to walk us through the history of the Violence Against Women Act. Thanks so much, Lynn.
Thank you, Colleen. It's a pleasure to be here today with the All In Together community for this very important conversation. We need you in this fight, and we appreciate everything you've been doing to mobilize around sexual harassment and violence in the workplace. And I am joining in the chorus of voices who are saying that this is an important moment in time. It's a cultural moment that I haven't seen in my 3 decades of activism. I served in the Obama White House as the first ever White House advisor on violence against women. And this was a new role that was created by Vice President Biden to carry out the work he started with the Violence Against Women Act in 1994. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the act, sort of what happened, why VAWA passed, and a little bit about what it does, how it's evolved over time, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague who's in the trenches today with the Violence Against Women Act. So I should say also that I was a very unlikely person to be serving in the White House. I'm a grassroots person like many of you. I worked in the women's health movement at the local level, and then in what we called at the time the battered women's movement. And I knew Senator Biden, because I testified in his Judiciary Committee from time to time on matters related to the implementation of the Violence Against Women Act. But in 1994, I was actually a shelter director when VAWA first passed Congress. And in the first year that VAWA passed, the numbers of women reaching out to our emergency shelter and calling us on our hotline increased by more than 40%, nearly doubled. So we knew that the legislation had an immediate impact. But Senator Biden first introduced the legislation, as you see here, in June 1990. And he did so because he was, as chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, reviewing crime data, and he noted that although crime generally was trending down, violence against women was trending up, and so he wanted to really explore this. He described himself as the data guy on crime at that time. So he brought in a lot of women to testify. He brought in experts, psychologists, advocates, lawyers, but he also brought in survivors themselves. So for the first time ever in the halls of Congress, women came in and told their stories of facing very severe violence. And as a result, Joe Biden wrote this act, and it had 3 broad but simple goals, as he noted in 1990, to make streets safer for women, to make homes safer for women, and to protect women's civil rights. And that last piece referred particularly to what was called the federal civil rights remedy, which would have provided women with the opportunity to sue their attackers in federal court. And I'll come back to that in just a couple of minutes. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, women came in, there were thousands of hours of testimony and told their stories about domestic violence, rape, battering, about poor law enforcement response, about lack of attention from the judiciary, about extreme violence that they faced at the hands of strangers, acquaintances, intimate partners, husbands, boyfriends, and other family members. So there was no escaping the record that was created on the extent of the violence. And in fact, the vice president's team in the Judiciary Committee, or then Senator Biden's team in the Judiciary Committee, drafted a report called A Week in the Life of American Women, and it detailed over 200 incidents of domestic violence, state-involved sexual assault, stalking that women were experiencing around the country. It was just a snapshot of 1 week in time. And that I found that report when I was a shelter director. I found it in my file and was stunned in reading it, because I was seeing women, bruised and bleeding women come into my shelter every day. But here was the picture nationally. So as a result of all of this work, there was opposition to the Violence Against Women Act in the beginning. People thought that it was anti-family, that it would bring every matter of family law into the federal judiciary. People thought that women would use this legislation to get a leg up in a divorce, as though people would put themselves through these kinds of stories just for some personal gain. That was said. People thought that it was really just sort of this feminist ideological piece of legislation that didn't really mean anything on the ground. And so a lot of work was done to overcome those views. And the vice president tells a story of how he didn't really have a lot of support in the beginning, or Vice President Biden tells a story of how he didn't really have a lot of support in the beginning, but he found his real partners for this legislation when he went out to states and met with state domestic violence coalitions and rape crisis centers and hotlines and battered women's shelters. There's a really wonderful story of when he went to Rhode Island to speak in the State House. And I have heard him tell this story for many years, but I was able to go back and confirm it not long ago with the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So he was invited to speak at the State House about this legislation. People didn't know that much about it. And here were all the battered women's shelters and local advocates and hotline workers. And he gave this amazing speech, and the response was overwhelming. And Deb DeBear, who is the Rhode Island Coalition Director, said this: here was a prominent U.S. Senator saying things that we had long wanted to hear and that we all believed. He made us feel like this actually might happen, that this bill might pass. And indeed it did, after all those many thousands of hours of testimony and the stories that helped overcome the opposition. Some of you probably know Pat Roos, a longtime activist, who then brought a coalition of women's groups together under the Now Legal Defense Fund at that time. And that group morphed into the National Task Force, which you'll hear about in just a few minutes. It's still very active today and leading this fight today. The federal judiciary in large part opposed the bill, particularly this civil rights remedy that would have given women this power to sue their attackers in federal court. So a lot of work was done. I give a lot of credit also to the National Association of Women Judges, who stood up for the Violence Against Women Act. And when the bill finally passed, the civil rights remedy survived at that time, but was later overturned in the Supreme Court in 2000. But the rest of the legislation has remained intact. So after the bill passed, states and local communities set about implementing it. As I mentioned, and that first year for us at the local level, the demand for services just went through the roof. We couldn't even keep up with the numbers of calls we were receiving. And it created a coordinated response on the ground so that grantees had to work together to get this funding. It's important to note that VAWA is a funding mechanism for states and local communities to carry out the work of responding to domestic violence and sexual assault, and that its criminal provisions are limited to federal crime. So there are criminal provisions in VAWA, but the main focus is getting funds out to the state and local level, and most of the criminal justice response actually sits at the state level. But VAWA uses funding conditions to further best practices. So for example, VAWA includes provisions that that states have to provide other funding for rape kit exams, that survivors themselves can't be responsible for that funding. And it also includes funding conditions that survivors can have a rape kit exam, whether or not they intend to report what happened to them to law enforcement. So those are just two examples. There's many others of how VAWA uses these funding conditions to implement best practices at the state and local level. The grants in VAWA range from improving the law enforcement response on the scene of a domestic violence crime or a sexual assault to mobilizing in rural communities. I got one of these early VAWA grants for rural organizing. I was working in Florida at the time, and we put up a map of the state, and we mapped out places where it was 100 miles or more to get to a domestic violence shelter, and that's where we put our funding in those areas of the state that were not served. It's not just about shelters, though. It's about all kinds of response, going out at the community level and meeting women where they are, and a lot of mobilizing among supporters to create these responses in rural communities is just one example. We also, another Florida example, was forming a partnership with legal services so that we could bring direct legal representation to domestic violence survivors in custody and family law matters. So those are some examples of the kind of work that was done. Next slide, please. But we also knew, and Joe Biden has always said, that this legislation should be dynamic, that it was never the end of the story, that as the bill was reauthorized, it would change and grow as we learn more about how women, families, communities experience violence, and indeed that happened. So through the reauthorizations in 2000 and 2005, a number of very critical things happened. First, I think everyone understood that the criminal justice response was just a small part of this, and that women had so many other needs. And that even when the system works well, it still is difficult, and it's particularly difficult for communities of color and other marginalized survivors to engage in that system, and that women and their families have a broad range of needs. And so housing is a really great example. In 2005, provisions were added to the legislation that created protections for survivors of domestic violence and federal housing programs, so that we were hearing women were being evicted if there was a domestic violence incident in their unit. There were stories about women going to the hospital in an ambulance and then coming home to an eviction notice on their door. So VAWA addressed that in 2005 and even strengthened that further in 2013 for sexual assault survivors as well. So in federally subsidized housing program, which is a broad range, there are these protections from evictions. VAWA has also had a long-standing commitment to cultural relevance and building capacity, so there are funding streams specific to note that communities of color and other marginalized survivors experience violence differently and also have additional obstacles to getting help, and so VAWA includes provisions that help create culturally relevant and specific programming. I want to give a lot of credit to the advocates who've pushed this forward, and I particularly note the strong work of the Sisters of Color Ending Sexual Assault in helping to create some of these specialized programs. Next slide, please. Well, I also want to note on the previous slide, it's talked about teens and young adults. And I should also say that VAWA has been very important in drawing attention and creating a response to violence as experienced by teens and young adults. We know that people ages 16 to 25 experience among the highest rates of domestic violence and the highest rates of sexual violence. In 2000, for example, VAWA created a definition of dating violence. So this wasn't a language in common usage. VAWA created this definition in the federal grant programs that was then replicated by 35 states in their state legislation. So it really furthered this understanding, and we see today much programming as a result. Next slide now. Thank you. So in 2013, some of you may remember what had increasingly become bipartisan legislation with a lot of support from both sides of the aisle. ended up in a very ugly partisan fight. It was sort of in keeping with the times that we find ourselves in on Capitol Hill. And there was a bill actually introduced on the majority side of the aisle at that time that would have dramatically undermined VAWA's key provisions. In particular, it would have undermined provisions that protect immigrant survivors, undocumented survivors of violence. From the beginning, from the very first bill in 1994, VAWA included protections for battered immigrant women to separate their status from their abusers, and then in 2000 included the U visas, which provide special visa protections for domestic violence and sexual assault victims, and also other types of crime. And so VAWA has always been critical in protecting undocumented survivors of violence. We know that survivors have to be able to come out of the shadows and get the protections they need, and that the isolation for undocumented survivors puts them at grave risk. And so in 2013, we saw this attempt by the majority side at that time to undermine those provisions, to take out all key confidentiality provisions and other pieces of that really helped support undocumented survivors. So that was the first thing this proposed legislation did. The second thing it did is not include the bullets 1 and 3, as you see here. So it did not include new provisions for Native women who experience among the highest rates of domestic violence and sexual assault, and who are very often assaulted by non-Native men. And that bill also did not include new proposed protections to protect LGBTQ survivors from discrimination so that everyone could get served. And so, but I will say that even though the bill started in that place with sort of this fighting, eventually both sides of the aisle came together to support it. And there have been some very important champions on both sides of the aisle. And, you know, I personally worked with folks, Democrat, Republican, over many years on the Violence Against Women Act. So while we got stuck at that moment in time, I think I'm hopeful that we're going to be past that moment this time around. Just to note for a minute that the tribal sovereignty protections, this was about recognizing that tribes had the authority, existing authority, to prosecute non-Native men for certain types of domestic violence crimes. It's a limited piece, and I think you'll hear a bit more about some efforts to strengthen it. But while it's limited, it was critically important in recognizing tribal sovereignty. It was a very important provision in VAWA 2013. And the LGBTQ protections were equally groundbreaking, because this meant that survivors of violence could not be turned away from shelters and could not be ignored by law enforcement or prosecutors, or any group that got VAWA funding had to serve LGBTQ survivors of violence. And we had particularly heard stories about trans women not receiving the kinds of services they needed. And so there's currently a lot of work going on to continue to implement these provisions that passed in VAWA 2013. I want to give a tremendous amount of credit before I turn it over to Terry Poore for the work that the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence did around VAWA 2013. The task force really hung together and worked night and day. I particularly also commend the Native women's groups who came to DC and basically put their lives on hold to come live in DC to make this happen. And they made it happen for Native women, and they made it happen for immigrant survivors and LGBTQ survivors and all women. So those efforts were remarkable, courageous, and we're very excited to see what happens next. And so my colleague Terry Poore, who works closely today on the Hill, will take it from here. I should say the Biden Foundation is not engaged in lobbying, but we are engaged in education about the importance of the Violence Against Women Act. And we also have programming that continues to carry on Vice President Biden's work, focusing on teens and young adults. So we're happy to be here with you all today. Looking forward to questions, and I'll turn it back over now.
Great. Thank you so much, Lynn, for that background on the history. And before I turn it over to Terry to discuss the current context around the reauthorization of VAWA in 2018, I just want to remind all of our participants that we are taking questions in the chat box. So if you have any questions for our awesome speakers at the end of their presentations, please type that into the chat box and we'll try to get to as many as we can. But with that, I'm so excited to introduce Terry Poor, who is the Policy Director at the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, and she'll be talking about what is coming up ahead, challenges and opportunities for the reauthorization of VAWA in 2018. Thanks so much, Terry.
Great, thank you, Colleen, and hi everyone. I'm so glad to be with you today with All In Together to talk about the Violence Against Women Act, and so grateful to Lynn Rosenthal. We've worked together for years and years, and for her leadership around VAWA as well. So let me talk a little bit about what's going on right now. So you can go to my first slide, Colleen. Great. So Lynn mentioned the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. The organization that I work for, the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, is a proud member. We are a coalition of the 56 state and territorial sexual assault coalitions, and through them about 1,300 rape crisis centers nationwide. And we are part of the National Task Force, which is a broad coalition of national organizations working together to secure an end to violence against women. So we're all diverse national organizations. We have a very broad and strong grassroots. We really welcome your participation as we move forward because, as Lynn alluded to, some of the work that we've been able to do in policy has been as a large result of people in communities speaking up about the importance of provisions to protect victims. So we welcome your participation, and you can go to the next slide. So through the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, we work really hard on VAWA reauthorization every 5 years, but it's really a process that begins way before the authorization expires. We get strong feedback from the field, whether it's through written surveys, webinars like this, lots of different individual and group conversations. We elicit extensive feedback from the field, from the rape crisis centers and domestic violence programs and advocates and survivor activists who are working in their communities. And we talk to them about how is VAWA working and how could it be better. And from that feedback, we then have about 20 different subject matter groups, everything from immigration to sexual assault to the criminal justice system. We have several different subject matter groups, and then we funnel those that feedback into those subject matter groups, and those subject matter groups work through all the feedback, work through all the suggestions, work through the current law, and come up with specific recommendations to improve the Violence Against Women Act. So we work together, we come up with those priorities, which I'm going to talk to you about today a little bit more. And then we hold really strongly together as we push forward for those issues so that we can get the wins that we know survivors really need. So our top priority for this VAWA reauthorization is no rollbacks to the protections for vulnerable populations gained in VAWA 2013. You heard Lynn reference, and you'll hear me reference again in just a minute, the important protections we gained for immigrant survivors, LGBTQ survivors, and the tribes. And so knowing that those were really hard fought, our sort of top priority going into this authorization is to protect those. But we also have some key enhancements that we want to ask for based on our process of really talking to the field and getting the input of advocates and survivors and allied professionals about the needs of survivors and communities. So you can go on to the next slide. So VAWA technically expired this past month in March 2018. Every time it's authorized for 5 years. And as Lynn explained, one of the key, really what VAWA is to some extent, is a collection of very vital grant programs that fund the support and work on a local level, whether it's rape crisis centers or local police departments or culturally specific organizations that really do the work of responding to domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. And so those grant programs have to be reauthorized every 5 years. So VAWA technically expired in March 2018, but if you'll go on to the next part of this slide, we know that lapses in authorization aren't that unusual. So while it is caused, I mean, you will notice some concern that advocates have about the fact that VAWA has expired, and that is really what's made us be focused on reauthorizing it, is because it does expire every 5 years technically. It's important to know that even if the authorization is technically lapsed, those programs can still be funded, the work can still happen, the work does not stop. So while there is an increased urgency to move forward, no need to panic. We've got time. It's not unusual that programs like VAWA lapse for some period of time. And even like the FBI lapses an authorization, sometimes for even more than a year. So not great, but not a reason to panic. But that is why we're focused on VAWA reauthorization right now. Okay, so next slide, please. So I wanted to talk for a few minutes, and I see that we're starting to get some questions in the chat, which is great, and I will come back to those in just a minute, but let me talk for just a minute about the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence priorities going forward. And these are, I've got 8 here that I'm gonna try to run through in just a few minutes, but know that there are other smaller items that are also of great importance. I just wanted to touch on a few of the biggest ones. So in this authorization, we really want to see an increased investment in prevention. We're hearing from the field the desperate need for that. We've seen, for example, one of the VAWA programs is the Rape Prevention and Education Program. And that program is at the CDC. It was part of the original VAWA back in 1994. And it provides essential funding to states and territories to support rape prevention and education programs in schools, in communities, and it's doing just really important evidence-based work. There are also a number of other youth and prevention programs in VAWA. So in the past few years, we've seen demand for these programs skyrocketing. The evidence base has progressed significantly on how best to change social norms around sexual assault and domestic violence. The current funding for the program is very near the authorized level, and we just know further investment is needed. Also, the Me Too movement and the national focus on sexual violence, high-profile cases, and all those sorts of things have really led to attention on the problem of sexual violence, but they've also increased the demand for prevention programs beyond providers' capacity. So we're asking Congress to increase the authorization for RPE from $50 million to $150 million to more closely meet our community's need for prevention. And also to ensure, because we really believe the best response to this moment in our society is to try and help the next generation have a stronger chance of leading lives free from violence. So that's why we really want to see an increased investment in prevention. And then you heard Lynn talk about the important strides made in the last VAWA related to tribal sovereignty. So VAWA 13, as she said, restored tribes' ability to prosecute non-Indian domestic violence offenders on tribal lands. And the tribes have been very successful at implementing this new law. The problem is it doesn't extend to sexual assault and trafficking. They aren't able to hold non-Indian offenders accountable on their lands yet. And we know that sexual violence is just a tremendous issue for Indigenous women. A 2016 study found that, from the National Institute of Justice, found that 56% of Native women experience sexual violence within their lifetime, and 1 in 7 of those experienced it this past year. So we know it's just a huge problem, and we believe something must be done. And that's why in this VAWA, we want Congress to return tribes' ability to prosecute all offenders of sexual assault and trafficking, in addition to domestic violence. So that's going to be a big priority for us. And then there are some very limited firearms provisions that we believe are very important, because we know that 4.5 million women in this country have reported that their abusers have used firearms to threaten, coerce, or intimidate them. And then we know that of those, 1.5 million reported that their abusers actually fired a gun at them or even injured them with a gunshot. And we want to protect all women from firearms violence. Everybody. We want to protect everybody, but the Violence Against Women Act is obviously focused on that in the context of domestic violence. So federal law prevents some domestic violence abusers from having a firearm. The problem is that those prohibitions do not apply to people that are in a dating relationship, even though half of domestic violence homicides are committed by an abuser in a dating relationship. So we really want to close this so-called boyfriend loophole, and we are asking Congress to do so in this next version of VAWA. We're also asking for funding and the development of good practices and protocols to make it easier and safer for courts and law enforcement to keep guns out of the hands of dangerous abusers. And we're not really asking for a whole new range of laws. We just need to make sure all victims of abusive physical force are protected from firearms violence. So this is really just tightening up. And then I'll go a little more quickly through the rest of these provisions. You know that Lynn mentioned that in VAWA 2013, VAWA included the first and still only federal law that expressly prevents discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, saying that LGBTQ survivors cannot be discriminated against in VAWA programs, and we want to make sure those laws are fully enforced. VAWA also focuses on the housing rights of survivors. So in VAWA 2013, we looked at making sure victims in public housing could move if they weren't safe in their housing, so we want to really strengthen that. And then we're looking at updating the definition of domestic violence in VAWA because it's been largely criminal justice focused, and we want it to more meet the needs of victims that are seeking services, whether it's legal assistance or shelter, all those sorts of things. And then we also want to grantees of some of the criminal justice oriented grants in VAWA to be able to look at alternative justice responses. We know that not all survivors feel comfortable with the criminal justice system. We know that a minority of sexual assault survivors report directly to law enforcement, but we still want those survivors to be able to access some aspect of justice, and knowing that they may experience victim blaming. So we want to continue exploring other options for survivors to seek justice. And last but definitely not least, just for purposes of this slide, is we want to continue to protect the rights of immigrant survivors in VAWA. And that includes making sure immigrant victims of crime have access to U visas, and also that they can seek protection without fear based on their immigration status. So I think those are the main priorities that I wanted to highlight today. I want to talk a little bit about the political landscape, so you can go on to the next slide. And then we should have ample time to make sure I can harken back to your questions in the chat, because I see they're there. And I tell you sort of what's going on around the progress and politics of VAWA reauthorization, knowing that those things could change within a moment's notice, because it's a very live process that we're in right now. But I'll start by telling you how in the House of Representatives, we're working closely with the House Judiciary Committee. Representative Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas is taking leadership for the minority in the House. And we're talking with Representative Sensenbrenner, Representative Poe, and various Republican House members. VAWA has always been bipartisan to figure out who is going to be our leader for the Republicans on that side. But Sheila Jackson Lee has really jumped out in front, has been working on a draft. We haven't yet seen that draft, but I think we're getting close. And negotiations are really ongoing with those priorities that I mentioned to you. And then in the Senate, it's been, as Lynn mentioned, historically been the Judiciary Committee where we've worked most closely on VAWA, and that's again true this year. In the Senate, Senator Chuck Grassley from Iowa and Senator Dianne Feinstein from California are the chair and ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and we've been working closely with them over the past several months. Senator Grassley's staff has had a whole range of briefings to talk through VAWA issues, and we've been doing a lot of negotiating with the advocacy groups that are part of the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence and others, and various Senate leaders to get to a point where a draft is going to be introduced. That could be, I know we're working closely moving that way. I know that there are some in leadership that would rather see a more streamlined bill than what the National Task Force wants. So those negotiations are always ongoing. On the administration side, we haven't been working closely directly with the White House, but we have met and been working with the new OVW Acting Director, Katie Sullivan. The administration has, however, not yet taken a position on whether they support VAWA reauthorization or not. So, of course, that ties their hands and limits our ability to work directly with them, but we have shared all our priorities with them and are in ongoing conversations. So finally, as we know, and you can go ahead and click the light bulb, if you would, we know that the midterm elections coming up are absolutely a factor in what happens with VAWA reauthorization. I'm sure many of you all know in a Congress that is approaching an election season that really impacts, the politics really impact what happens. And so, you know, you could talk to a variety of pundits who would all have a different look at how politics are affecting legislation generally, and then Violence Against Women Act reauthorization specifically. You all know, I'm sure, that it gets more difficult to reach agreements and move things forward the closer we get to an election. So I do think those dynamics will impact us as we continue to work on VAWA reauthorization. Whether or not we're able to get it across the finish line before the midterms or not is a big question mark. But we will be working passionately, as we always do, on the issues that are important to survivors and communities. So I think that is the end of the presentation part of my remarks, just to say that VAWA is so important, and that as we talk about ways that you can be involved, we hope that you help us with our top line messages, or the importance of protecting vulnerable survivors and the importance of investing more in prevention in this Me Too moment.
Great, thank you so much, Terry, and thank you so much, Lynn, for that awesome information about the Violence Against Women Act. Now I want to pivot a little bit and talk a little bit about how you can take action on these important issues. I want to point you to, on the All In Together website, we have this handy dandy action center, which is your one-stop shop for raising your voice on issues that matter to you. And this is a great way, a great place to start advocating around VAWA if you so choose. As you can see from this screenshot from our website, we have resources if you're interested in sharing your story through an email, if you're interested in calling your legislator, or even if you're interested in scheduling an in-person meeting with your representative. Those are all things you can do through the Action Center. Also, if you're not sure who your legislators are, if you plug in your zip code, we tell you who your federal legislators are. This is, for example, our last workshop for the Gretchen Carlson Leadership Initiative was in White Plains, so that's what we have here. And you can go in and see even if your representative, for example, if you live in New York, your representative would be Kirsten Gillibrand, and you can see sort of maybe where she's fallen on past issues related to the Violence Against Women Act, so you can really tailor your conversation with a staff person in her office to her past positions. And it can also take you to her campaign website if you're interested in how the midterm elections will be affecting the reauthorization of VAWA. And as you take action, 3 steps that we would recommend here at All In Together is, the first one is just make it easy. It's really helpful that after you visited the Action Center and know your representative's phone numbers, just plug them into your cell phone, follow them on social media, and sign up for their mailing list, so that if you even have a spare 5 minutes when you're walking from your car to the office, use those 5 minutes to call and talk to your representative about these issues. Another recommendation we have is to set aside the time to engage. Schedule in 30 minutes every week for your advocacy time, just like you would schedule in coffee with a friend or going to the gym. It makes it easier if it's actually on your calendar to remember to do this really important work. We also want to encourage you to encourage your team. I know a lot of people who are tuned into this webinar today are in leadership positions in their community. So it's important to talk to the people in your life about what you've learned in this webinar, and to encourage them to raise their voices around these issues as well. Because as both Lynn and Terry really emphasized, this is really a movement, and it's going to take all of us pitching in our voices to get important pieces of legislation like this passed. And last but not least, I really want to call out that as when you reach out to your representatives, it's really important to share your story and be really specific about why you think it's important that VAWA is reauthorized, or if there is a specific tenant that Terry mentioned, one of those priorities that you're the most passionate about, to really emphasize how that will affect you or your community and why reauthorization is so important. I can't stress enough how these specific calls to action, these specific reasons why you support VAWA are really going to make a difference in your call or email that you send. So with that, thank you so much for staying engaged to this point, and I'm excited to open it up to questions. I know we have a couple of exciting ones in the chat box. One question that I'll lift up first, it sounds like this one is a good one for you, Terry, to address, is can you talk about partner violence and women with disabilities? This is a question from Julie.
Sure, I'll get started, and Lynn may have some things to add too. There is a Violence Against Women Act program specifically on victims with disabilities, and so that does give the ability for those who write for and receive that discretionary grant to address those issues specifically, but it is a rather small program, and I know in our work to talk to the field, there is more that could be done there. But Lynn, did you want to address that one as well? Maybe not just now. I will say that there is that one program, and of course those issues can be addressed in other contexts in VAWA, but I do think there's more that can be done there.
I'm sorry, I'm here now. I agree with Terry that that's kind of an under-resourced program, and according to some data, women with disabilities have higher rates of partner violence, and it's important to think about the kinds of things that could happen to somebody as a result of abuse, interfering with their mobility devices or denying access to medications, or not physically caring for a person who needs it, and sexual abuse, and denying access to medical appointments. So it creates very specific kinds of obstacles and strategies of abuse that we should all be mindful of and work together to increase those resources.
Great. Our next question comes from Audrey, and she asked, with the loosening of Title IX protections, are you looking at ways to integrate those protections within VAWA?
Well, we're glad that there already are some important protections in VAWA related to campus sexual assault in a couple different areas. In the 2013 reauthorization, there were some important amendments to the Clery Act. That the Clery Act is a federal law that governs to some extent addressing sexual assault on campus, but there were some really important provisions related to Title IX that were integrated into the Clery Act. And so those are strong. So part of our outlook going into this next reauthorization is to really hold on to those. There really is kind of a mixed environment in terms of what different politicians want to do around protecting Title IX rights. And we are, this is not a VAWA issue, but we are watching very closely for what we suspect will be soon a new rule promulgated from the Department of Education around Title IX. So it will be really important that everybody that cares about this issue make comments to that proposed rule when it comes out. But specifically in the context of VAWA, we really want to hold on to those protections because they do require things like accommodations for survivors, prevention education, and those sorts of things. And then there's also a campus program that has been, the funding for that has been increased, that really allow advocates to work together to do some important work on campus. So I think we're a little ambivalent about how much to pull in, knowing the environment we're in where not everybody agrees with all the aspects of Title IX. We certainly do, but all the aspects of Title IX enforcement that have been part of the law for a while. And it's important to note that even if there are some rollbacks at the Department of Education level, that Title IX is still the law of the land, and it's still a requirement of institutions to enforce those rights.
Great, thanks for that. And finally, we have a question from Joan, who is wondering about family court. She asks, what, if anything, the current proposals do regarding family court?
Yeah, and Lynn, I'll let you address this one too if you like. I mean, there are definitely justice system programs that look at issues of family court. The family and juvenile court judges have been major allies in the work to do VAWA and have taken a strong role in building specific courts to address these issues. I will also say that the Legal Assistance to Victims program can address some of these issues as well. And there has been some attempt to expand that program to include custody issues of children in domestic violence and sexual abuse situations. So there's some, but I'm sure that we could do more as well.
Yeah, I would like to address this too, and in large part thanks to Joan and other people's amazing work. This issue is very much on the radar, and also it's difficult to sort of figure out the federal nexus on it sometimes. But in 2013, VAWA included a court improvement program that was specifically designed to look at these issues and how we could create best practices in family courts. It is, as some of you may know, sort of a shocking area as you begin to read these family law cases. And one of the things I realized when I was looking at this in 2013 is that sort of the VAWA principles of centering safety for survivors and accountability for offenders in whatever form that accountability might take are just missing in large part from family courts. And so it seems to be one place where these VAWA principles have not really taken hold. And in fact, the justice system kind of gets turned on its head in these cases. And, you know, the false narrative that's created against domestic violence survivors can be sort of overwhelming. And there's all these various players in the court system that can be a part of it. So I would urge people interested in this issue to look at that model court improvement program that was created in VAWA 2013, and also just for all of us to keep thinking together about what could be a potential federal response in this area.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lynn and Terry, for that great actionable information for us all. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today. We really hope that even as we sign off this webinar, that this is just the beginning of this really important conversation. We've included our emails on this last slide, as well as the social media handles for All In Together. And we really hope that you stay engaged and keep in touch with us. We'd love to hear all about how you're engaged around the reauthorization of VAWA. Thanks so much for taking the time, and take care.